Hi, I'm Julie Carr. I'm reading from Mud, Blood, and Ghosts, Populism, Eugenics, and Spiritualism in the American West. This is a book in which I trace my great-grandfather's life. He was Omer Madison Kem. He was a settler in Nebraska on the Homestead Act. He became a member of the First Populist Party of the 1890s and represented Congress as a member of that party. He then became a spiritualist, a believer in ghosts and spirits, and eventually became a avid and very public eugenicist, believing for and calling for the forced sterilization of people he considered unfit to breed, which turned out to be many different categories of people. So I will read four very short sections from the beginning, two sections in the middle, and one from the end, and I'll give a little context as I go. Thanks. This is the opening paragraphs from the introduction titled Ownership and Thievery. I-90 runs right along the top of Indiana, truck heavy with glare. Just a little to the north lies Lake Michigan, a little to the south, ancestral ghosts. So bland and so bad, America's highways, where it feels like nothing good could ever begin. 15 and determined, Alice drives her body through her namesake's birth state, a farmhouse, a silo, a cluster of cows. Days Inn, Ramada, Motel 6. Under all that road lie the swamps that are no longer there. Wetlands fed by glacial melt slashes where ample trees once rose straight out from water. There is no history that's not in the day. Just over the Illinois border, we check into a Best Western built into the parking lot of a Target. Alice sleeps. I lie on my side, staring at the past as it slips in and out of focus on my phone. So the book begins with this road trip with my daughter Alice, and there are many road trips throughout the book. So as I spend a lot of time in history and talking about laws and land policy and particular events and movements throughout this story, I also keep kind of circling back into the present. And in that present, I'm often on the road. This is Disorder, and this section is the ending of the chapter on what the populists were doing and not doing when they were in Congress and in the Senate. Um, Disorder. We begin with a body, a legislative body, a national body, a body in a house. Like all bodies, this body has boundaries, skin. It also has holes, just as the house has doors and windows. And just as doors and windows can be broken, the body itself is vulnerable. It is, after all, alive. There is illness, pain, and capacity, rupture, or simply there is more. Law's job, law's science, is to mark and underscore the boundaries around this body, to repair where there is fissure, to remove excess, to sew the body shut again. Inside the house's chambers, the law's tools, the law's method is language. While on the streets, the law's tools are batons, tasers, guns, ropes, and cuffs. The law as boundary cannot help but be armed. To those who transgress it, it replies with absolute menace. All vigilant efforts to protect a body from invasion will tend toward violence one way or another. In other words, language has a violence of its own. And in that section, I'm obliquely referencing January 6th, but I'm also thinking about the fact that the populists, this third party in the 1890s, did break into the House. They did make their way to be represented as poor farmers and laborers in the legislative body. But once there, they participated in the process of reinscribing those borders and boundaries in their participation in the reinstating of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, importantly, was argued for not really in terms of the question of labor, as is often thought, or even immigration in a sense, because the arguments were really about race. They were about what kind of people, what race of people would be invited into this body and would be considered to be capable of reproducing the body's sense of itself, its ideology, which is to say, its democracy. So that reinscribing of borders through language is a big part of what the populists did in their first year in Congress. What they also did is reinscribe borders through silence, which I also write about in this chapter, because 1893, the year they entered Congress, was also the peak year of lynchings of Black people in this country. And that issue received no language and no discussion in Congress at all. So, in a sense, the borders are inscribed both by language and by silence, which I write about. And now I'll read a very short piece from, actually a slightly longer piece from the chapter called Blood. And this is the chapter in which I talk most about eugenics and the sort of fascist ideology that is eugenics. This is again from the end of that section, and it's called Party 2017. The circle around my father's people and my mother's people was tightening, I wrote in one version of this book's introduction. My mother was Jewish. Far-flung members of her family, originally from Ukraine, had been murdered for the eugenic cause called Nazism, and I know nothing more about them. The young Omer Kem once threw a hard crust of bread into the face of a Jewish girl for no reason other than that she was there and a Jew. He referred to the bankers he hated as Shylocks, and even as he once respectfully quoted a rabbi describing the trauma of anti-Semitism, he also wrote that the old Jews were an ignorant, self-centered, savage, and brutal people. This ordinary, and why should it be ordinary, and intermittent anti-Semitism can feel personal when I remember how my mother so often wore the face of fear, especially after she'd ridden in a crowded subway car. But there's more to it than a personal insult. American eugenicists and white supremacists more generally strongly influenced Nazi policy. The authors of the Nuremberg Laws found guidance in the genocide and containment of indigenous people, in Jim Crow and anti-miscegenation laws, in restrictive immigration, and in U.S. sterilization laws. Hitler, having been inspired by Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race, followed the model provided by the Americans in his law for the prevention of defective progeny, through which over 400,000 Germans were forcibly sterilized. U.S. sterilization laws, which my great-grandfather so passionately championed, didn't only deeply harm thousands of Americans. These laws also provided one seed and model for the policies that wiped many of my maternal ancestors out. But this tension lies in all of us. All of us, if we looked hard and long enough, carry the ghosts of victims and the ghosts of perpetrators. And sometimes these are the same people. And I'll just finish with a bit from the very last chapter, which is called Power. And in this chapter, I really look back at the First World War and what the First World War did to American international policy, but also the domestic scene and what kinds of sort of attitudes of nativism and continued white supremacist violence that war contributed to in its people. And there's a lot to say about that, but for now, I'll just say that I was trying to think about what it would be to be, as my great-grandfather was, the parent of a child sent to war for uncertain and unclear causes. Neighbor. During the Vietnam War, my mother became a committed anti-war activist, organizing marches, rallies, and study groups in Cambridge, Mass, where we lived. In 1967, she spearheaded a campaign to get an anti-war referendum on the city ballot. Presenting her petition to the city council, she spoke forcefully and bluntly, as she generally did. The Vietnam War is brutal, senseless, and wasteful, she told them. People hate this war. I was an infant then, and my brother was a toddler. We went to the protests in a baby carriage. She used to say, it was not politics that got to me. What did I care about politics? It was thinking about the neighbor's son. In fact, she cared a lot about politics, but she understood politics to begin with a turn toward the neighbor. The neighbor, the person you might not even know, but whose kinship bonds you can nevertheless hold in your mind, might call you toward a life you did not plan but cannot refuse. This is how I understand what happened to her. As the mother of two small children, she could and did imagine what it would be like to have a child at war. And because she could imagine that terror, she fought against it. I want Omer of the 19 teens and 20s to be able to imagine the neighbor's son when that son is working in a shipping yard for 12 hours a day with nowhere to sleep at the end of it. And I should say that the First World War also brought with it a very anti-labor attitude among many of the middle class, as he then was a part of. Um, and an anti-labor attitude is often also an anti-immigration or immigrant attitude. I want him to imagine the neighbor's son or daughter when that son or daughter is Black in any city in America in 1919 or before that date or after, when hostile white people and their police murderously rage. I want Omer to be able to imagine the neighbor's child as an infant in an asylum or a migrant at the border. But if I want Omer to be able to extend his imagination and his concern to all these children and their families, then I need to be able to do the same, and I so often fail. Imagination is powerful, and imagination is weak and fragile. Imagination through which we can expand our sense of responsibility and care beyond our immediate friends or family, beyond our neighborhood, city, or country, beyond even our species, is not the work of an individual mind, but of an entire community. The wider that community, the wider the imagination of its members, and the wider the circle of care. A new imaginary is required, an egalitarian imaginary that apprehends the interdependency of lives, writes Judith Butler. All kinship, in the end, is imaginary, writes Ruha Benjamin, which does not mean it isn't real. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.